The attack came 3 days after the humans arrived at Meridian Outpost, and it came without warning, as Drevok attacks always did, with thousands of chitinous bodies pouring out of the tree line like a living tide of death and destruction. Velrath was in the command center when the alarms started screaming, and he rushed to the tactical display to see red dots spreading across the eastern perimeter like a disease consuming healthy flesh. All units fall back to secondary defensive positions, he ordered, because this was standard Corvani doctrine when facing a Drevok probe, and the idea was to let them overextend and then counterattack when they were spread thin. But then Captain Brennan's voice came over the communication channel, and what he said made Velrath stop cold. "Negative on that order, Commander," Brennan said, and his voice was calm, as if he was discussing the weather. "My soldiers will hold the eastern perimeter, and we respectfully request that your forces hold their positions and let us handle this." Velrath felt anger rise in his chest at this challenge to his authority. But before he could respond, Lieutenant Morgan's voice joined the channel. "Commander, please trust us," she said. "We know what we are doing." Against his better judgment, Velrath granted the request, and he told himself it was because he wanted to see what these humans could really do. But deep down, he knew it was also because part of him expected them to fail and wanted to be proven right about their weakness. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Through the external cameras, Velrath watched the humans take up positions along the eastern wall, and he noticed that they moved differently than his own soldiers, with a fluid coordination that came not from training, but from something deeper, something instinctual. The Drevok wave hit the wall like a hammer striking stone, and the sound of their screeching filled the air. Hundreds of them began to climb toward the human positions, and then the humans opened fire. Velrath had seen many battles in his long life, but he had never seen anything quite like this, because the humans did not simply shoot at the Drevok. They destroyed them with a precision and ferocity that seemed impossible for such small creatures. Corporal Amy Reyes was the first one he noticed, a small woman with dark hair and steady hands, and she stood at her position and fired again and again without flinching, even as the Drevok claws came closer and closer. A Drevok warrior reached the top of the wall and drove its claw through her shoulder, and Velrath expected her to fall, but instead she grabbed the creature by its throat with her free hand and shoved her weapon into its mouth and pulled the trigger. She kept fighting with blood pouring down her arm and a smile on her face that made Velrath's scales rise again. Private Ben Torres was dragging a wounded comrade toward the medical station, with one arm while firing his weapon with the other, and he was shouting something in a language Velrath did not understand. But the tone of his voice was not fear or desperation, it was defiance. But it was Lieutenant Morgan who truly shocked him. A group of Drevok had broken through a weak section of the wall, and were about to overwhelm a squad of human soldiers, and Morgan grabbed her communication device and called in artillery support on her own position. "Danger close," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Fire for effect on my coordinates." The artillery shells landed among the Drevok and the humans alike, and when the smoke cleared, the Drevok were dead, and the humans were still standing, wounded and bleeding, but still standing, still fighting. Sergeant Cole appeared in the middle of the carnage like a demon from some ancient nightmare, his face covered in blood that might have been his own, or might have been from Elwyn's. The Drevok he had killed, and he was laughing as he fought, actually laughing, as if this was the most fun he had ever had in his life. The battle lasted for 2 hours, and when it was over, the Drevok retreated into the forest, and Velrath realized he had just witnessed something that had never happened before, in all the centuries of war against the swarm. The Drevok had retreated from a ground engagement, not because they had achieved their objective, not because they had been recalled by the hive mind, but because they had been beaten back by 30 soft pink creatures who had no claws and no armor and no natural weapons of any kind. Velrath left the command center and walked to the human medical bay, and what he saw there confused him even more than the battle itself. The wounded humans were laughing. They were sitting on medical beds with holes in their bodies and blood on their clothes, and they were making jokes and slapping each other on the back, and smiling like they had just returned from a celebration rather than a fight for their lives. Sergeant Cole was sitting on a table, stitching a wound on his own arm closed, and he was humming a tune that sounded almost cheerful as he pushed the needle through his flesh again and again. "Sergeant," Velrath said, and Cole looked up at him with those bright, hungry eyes. "Does that not hurt?" Cole looked down at his arm, as if he had forgotten he was wounded, and then he shrugged. "Sure it hurts," he said, "but pain is just information, Commander, and I have learned to read that information without letting it control me." Captain Brennan approached with his arm in a sling and a bandage wrapped around his head, and despite his injuries, he moved with the same calm confidence he always showed. "Commander Velrath," he said, "I hope we have given you some reason to believe in our abilities." Velrath did not know what to say, because his mind was still trying to process everything he had witnessed, and finally he asked the question that had been burning in his thoughts since the battle began. "Captain, how do your people do this? How can you smile and laugh after such violence? How can you treat your own suffering as if it does not matter?" Brennan looked at his soldiers, at the wounded men and women who were joking and singing and acting as if they had not just survived a nightmare. And when he looked back at Velrath, his eyes held something that might have been pride, or might have been sorrow, or might have been both. "Commander," he said, "we have been doing this to each other for 10,000 years, and compared to the wars we have fought among ourselves, the Drevok are amateurs." He paused, and something flickered across his face, a shadow of memories that Velrath could not see, but could somehow feel. "We did not evolve to be the biggest, or the strongest, or the fastest," Brennan continued. "We evolved to be the ones who kept going, no matter what, the ones who got up every time we were knocked down, the ones who simply refused to accept that we were beaten." He smiled, and this time Velrath recognized the expression on his face. It was the look of a survivor. "The Drevok think they understand war," Brennan said, "but they have never faced a species that was born from war, shaped by war, and perfected by war. And by the time they realize their mistake, it will be too late." Velrath left the medical bay and walked back to his quarters, and for the first time since this war began, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt hope. Commander Velrath stood at the observation deck of his warship and watched the human vessel approach through the darkness of space, and he felt nothing but disappointment as he studied the small craft that carried the soldiers who were supposed to help them win this war. The ship was called the Resolute, and it was tiny compared to the massive Corvani battlecruisers that surrounded it. And Velrath wondered what the Galactic Council had been thinking when they decided to bring these creatures into their ancient conflict against the Drevok swarm. For 300 years his people had fought against the swarm, and for 300 years they had slowly been losing ground on every front. And now, in their desperation, they had reached out to a newly discovered species from a small blue planet called Earth. Velrath had read the reports about humans, and nothing in those reports had impressed him in the slightest, because these creatures were soft and weak. No natural weapons or armor of any kind, and their lifespans were so short that a single Corvani elder could outlive 5 generations of them. His second officer, a young female named Theron, joined him at the observation window and spoke in a quiet voice. "The human commander has requested permission to board, sir," she said, and Velrath could hear the same doubt in her voice that he felt in his own heart. "Grant them permission," Velrath replied, "and prepare the integration briefing room, because apparently we are going to fight alongside these creatures whether we like it or not." An hour later, Velrath entered the briefing room and got his first look at real humans in the flesh. And he had to fight hard to keep the disappointment from showing on his face. There were about 30 of them, standing in neat rows, and they were even smaller than he had expected, with their soft pink skin and their fragile bodies that looked like they would break apart at the first strong wind. Slightest impact, and he noticed that many of them had scars on their faces and hands, which surprised him because he had assumed such weak creatures would not survive injuries severe enough to leave marks. Their leader stepped forward and introduced himself as Captain Jack Brennan, and he was a tall man by human standards, with short brown hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. And beside him stood a woman with red hair pulled back tight against her head, who introduced herself as Lieutenant Katie Morgan. "Commander Velrath," Brennan said in a voice that was calm and steady, "my soldiers and I are honored to fight beside the Corvani, and we want you to know that we will not let you down." Velrath studied the human captain and tried to find some sign of the warrior spirit that the council claimed these creatures possessed, but all he saw was a small, soft being who would probably die in the first minutes of actual combat. "Captain Brennan," Velrath replied, "be honest with you, because I believe honesty is more valuable than false comfort. And the truth is that I do not understand why the council believes your people can help us against the Drevok." He expected the human to become angry or defensive, but instead Brennan simply smiled, and there was something in that smile that Velrath could not quite identify. "I understand your concerns, Commander," Brennan said, "and I know we do not look like much compared to your warriors, but I promise you that appearances can be deceiving." A scarred human male stepped forward from the ranks, and Velrath noticed that this one had a face that looked like it had been torn apart and put back together multiple times, with white lines crossing his dark skin in a pattern that spoke of violence survived. "Sergeant Danny Cole," the man said, and his voice was rough, like gravel scraping against stone. "I have a question for you, Commander, if you do not mind." "Permission," curious despite himself. "How close do the Drevok like to fight?" Cole asked, and his eyes were bright with something that looked almost like hunger. Velrath considered the question before answering, because it seemed like a strange thing to ask. "The Drevok prefer close combat," he said. "They are a swarm species, and they overwhelm their enemies with numbers and claws and teeth, and they do not stop until everything in front of them is dead." Cole smiled at this answer, and it was not a pleasant smile, and Velrath felt something cold move through his chest when he saw it. "Good," Cole said. "That is very good." Lieutenant Morgan spoke up then, and her voice was soft but carried clearly through the room. "Commander, can you tell us about your previous engagements with the Drevok? Because we want to understand how they think and how they react to different situations." Velrath spent the next hour describing the horrors of fighting the swarm, the endless waves of chitinous bodies and razor-sharp claws, the way they moved without fear, because the hive mind did not care how many individual Drevok died as long as the swarm survived, and the psychological toll of facing an enemy that simply never stopped coming no matter how many you killed. The humans listened in silence, and as Velrath spoke, he noticed something strange about their expressions, because they did not show the fear he expected, or the concern that any rational being would feel when hearing about such a terrible enemy. Instead, they showed something else entirely, something that looked almost like anticipation. When he finished speaking, Captain Brennan nodded slowly and turned to his soldiers. "You heard the commander," he said. "The Drevok like to get close and personal, and they think numbers will save them, and they have never faced anything that truly scared them." He paused and looked at each of his soldiers in turn. "Us teach them what fear really means." The humans responded with a sound that Velrath had never heard before, a low rumbling roar that came from deep in their chests, and it made the scales on his back rise up in a way that only happened when he sensed danger nearby. Later that night, Velrath sat alone in his quarters and reviewed the human personnel files, and what he read there disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. These creatures had been fighting wars against each other since before his species had learned to build fire, and the list of conflicts in their history was so long that it took him hours to read through it, and the methods they had used to kill each other were creative in ways that made him feel slightly sick. He read about trenches filled with poison gas, and bombs that could level entire cities, and weapons that could end all life on their planet if they chose to use them. And he read about how they had developed these horrors not to fight alien threats, but to conquer each other. Invaders, but to use against their own kind. And yet these same creatures also created beautiful music and art, and they loved their families and their friends with a fierce loyalty that was almost touching. And they had come halfway across the galaxy to help a species they had never met fight an enemy that was not their own. Commander Velrath put down the files and stared at the wall of his cabin for a long time. He did not know what to make of these humans, but something told him that his life was about to change in ways he could not predict, and for the first time since he had learned about their arrival, he felt something other than disappointment. He felt uncertain, and underneath that uncertainty, he felt the first small stirring of something that might have been fear. The Drevok returned 7 days later, with a force 10 times larger than before, and this time they did not leave after their first attack. Instead, they surrounded Meridian Outpost on all sides and cut off every route of escape and supply. Velrath stood in the command center and stared at the tactical display that showed the sea of red completely encircling their position, and he felt the cold weight of despair settle into his chest like a stone. "Reinforcements are 14 cycles away," Theron reported, and her voice was barely a whisper. "There is no way we can hold out that long against these numbers." Velrath knew she was right, because Corvani tactical doctrine was clear about situations like this, and the protocol was to evacuate all essential personnel and destroy the outpost rather than let it fall into enemy hands. He was reaching for the evacuation controls when Captain Brennan entered the command center with Lieutenant Morgan and Sergeant Cole close behind him. "Commander," Brennan said, "I would like to request that you delay any evacuation plans." Velrath turned to face the human and saw that same calm confidence that he had come to recognize, that same steady certainty that seemed to exist in all of these strange creatures. "Captain, we are surrounded by an army that outnumbers us 50 to 1, and our reinforcements will not arrive for 2 weeks, so please explain to me what possible strategy could allow us to survive this situation." Brennan smiled, and it was not a nice smile. "Commander, have you ever heard of something called psychological warfare?" What followed was unlike anything Velrath had ever seen in all his years of military service, because the humans did not wait for the Drevok to attack them. Instead, they attacked the Drevok in ways that made no tactical sense at first. When night fell, teams of humans slipped out of the outpost and disappeared into the darkness like ghosts, and Velrath watched their tracking signals on the tactical display as they moved through the Drevok lines without being detected. Specialist Ryan Cortez led one of these teams, and his mission was to sabotage the Drevok supply lines that stretched back into the forest. And he accomplished this mission not by destroying everything he found, but by destroying just enough to cause problems, and leaving the rest intact. "Why not destroy it all?" Velrath asked when Cortez returned. "Because we want them to use it," Cortez replied with a grin that showed his teeth. "We want them to rely on those supplies and then have them fail at the worst possible moment. And we want them to never know which supplies are safe and which ones are traps." Medic Laura Chen had a different mission, and she had set up a communication station that intercepted Drevok signals and broadcast false information back to them, mimicking distress calls and panic transmissions that drew Drevok reinforcements into ambushes that the humans had prepared. But it was what Sergeant Cole did that truly horrified Velrath. Cole took a team of soldiers deep into enemy territory and returned 3 hours later, dragging a Drevok commander behind him. Still alive, still conscious, still fully aware of what was happening to it. "Why did you bring it back alive?" Velrath demanded, because taking prisoners was not something anyone did in a war against the Swarm. Since the Drevok did not negotiate and did not surrender, and did not stop fighting until they were dead. Cole looked at the Drevok commander with those bright, hungry eyes of his, and when he spoke, his voice was soft and almost gentle. "Because now the others know that we can," he said, "and they will wonder why we did not kill it, and they will fear what we might be planning to do with it, and that fear will spread through the hive mind like a poison." He leaned closer to the captured Drevok and spoke directly to it. "Go back to your swarm," he said, "and tell them what you saw here tonight, and tell them that we are coming for all of them." Then he released the Drevok and let it scurry back into the darkness toward its own lines. Velrath watched all of this unfold from the command center, and as the nights passed, he began to notice something changing in the way the Drevok behaved, because their attacks became less coordinated, and their formations became sloppy, and their advanced scouts started showing signs of hesitation. The swarm was becoming afraid. They were experiencing something that no prey species had ever made them feel before, and they did not know how to process it, and their confusion made them vulnerable in ways that simple military force could never achieve. "Commander," Lieutenant Morgan said one night as they watched another human team slip out into the darkness, "do you understand now what we are doing?" Because he was beginning to understand, even if he did not fully comprehend how such soft, weak creatures could be so terrifying. "You are not just fighting them," he said, "you are hunting them." Morgan smiled, and it was the same smile that Cole wore. The same smile that Brennan showed when he talked about human history. The smile of a predator who knows that it is the most dangerous thing in the darkness. "Commander, humans evolved on a planet where everything was trying to kill us," she said. "The weather tried to kill us, the animals tried to kill us, the diseases tried to kill us, and we survived all of it by learning to be more dangerous than anything we faced." She looked out into the night, where her soldiers were moving through the Drevok lines like shadows. "We learned that the best way to defeat a predator is to make it fear you. And we learned that fear is sometimes more powerful than any weapon." Velrath thought about this for a long time. He remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about the great predators of his homeworld, creatures that had hunted the Corvani in the ancient times before they had built their civilization. Those predators had been eliminated thousands of years ago, and the Corvani had forgotten what it felt like to be prey. But watching the humans work, watching them move through the darkness and strike without warning, and disappear before the Drevok could respond, Velrath began to remember, and he realized that the Drevok were not facing soldiers. They were facing something far more primal, something that stirred in the deepest parts of his own mind. Something that made him want to run, even though he knew the humans were on his side. The humans were apex predators wearing the skin of friendly allies, and the Drevok had made the terrible mistake of threatening their pack. By the end of the first week, the Drevok had lost more warriors to human night raids than they had lost in the initial assault on the outpost, and their lines had begun to contract as they pulled their forces back to protect their commanders and their supply lines. They were still surrounding the outpost, but they were no longer advancing. They were waiting. And in war, Velrath knew, the side that waits is the side that fears. He looked at the humans around him, at these small, fragile creatures who had turned the tide of a hopeless siege, through nothing but cleverness and cruelty and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. And he felt something that he had never expected to feel. He felt grateful that they were on his side. On the 12th day of the siege, the Drevok Hive commander committed every warrior in the swarm to one massive final assault. And Velrath knew that this would be the battle that decided everything, because there would be no retreat and no mercy and no second chances. The morning sky turned dark with the bodies of flying Drevok scouts, and the ground trembled with the footsteps of thousands upon thousands of warriors marching toward the outpost walls. And Velrath felt his heart beating fast in his chest as he watched death approaching from every direction. He found Captain Brennan standing on the eastern rampart, with his soldiers arranged behind him in perfect formation. And the human commander was looking out at the approaching horde with an expression that Velrath could not understand. "Captain," Velrath said, "this is the end, and I want you to know that it has been an honor to fight beside your people." Brennan turned to look at him, and there was no fear in his eyes, no desperation, no acceptance of defeat. There was only that same calm certainty that had been there since the first day they met. "Commander," Brennan said, "this is not the end. This is what we trained for. This is the moment when we show the galaxy what humanity can do when our backs are against the wall." He turned to face his soldiers and raised his voice so they could all hear him. "Today we fight not just for ourselves, but for everyone who sent us here, believing that we could make a difference. And today we prove that their faith was not misplaced." The humans responded with that low, rumbling roar that Velrath had heard on the first day, and this time he understood what it meant. It was the sound of a pack preparing to hunt, the sound of predators who had chosen their prey. The Drevok hit the walls like a tsunami crashing against the shore, and the battle that followed was the most violent thing Velrath had ever witnessed in all his long years of life. Parted sentence. Private Megan Torres was stationed at a breach in the northern wall with a single blow, and any sane creature would have fallen back and sought medical attention. But Torres was human, and humans did not follow the rules that govern sane creatures. She propped herself against the wall and continued firing, and when her weapon ran dry, she drew a blade from her belt and kept fighting, and she held that breach alone for 11 minutes until reinforcements arrived, and when they dragged her away from the wall, she was still trying to get back to the fight. Corporal Nick Bradley saw a Drevok commander climbing the western wall and knew that if it reached the top, it would rally the other warriors and break through their defenses. So he did something that no Corvani soldier would ever consider. He ran toward the creature and tackled it. They fell together, the human and the Drevok, tumbling down the outside of the wall, in a tangle of limbs and claws. And when they hit the ground, Bradley's body was broken, but his hands were still wrapped around the Drevok's throat, and he was still squeezing. The Drevok was dead when they pried Bradley's fingers loose. Lieutenant Morgan coordinated the defense from the command center, and her voice over the radio was cold and steady as she directed troops and called in fire support and made decisions that sent soldiers to their deaths. And she did not hesitate, and she did not flinch, because hesitation and flinching would have gotten even more people killed. But it was Captain Brennan who showed Velrath the true meaning of human courage. A group of Drevok warriors broke through the main gate and charged toward the command center, and Brennan moved to intercept them with only a handful of soldiers at his side. And the fight that followed was brief and brutal, and ended with Brennan standing over a pile of dead Drevok with a wound in his chest that Velrath could see was fatal. "Captain," Velrath shouted, running toward him, "you need medical attention immediately." Brennan looked down at the hole in his chest, and then looked up at Velrath with a smile that was somehow peaceful. "Not yet, Commander," he said. "The battle is not over yet." And he kept fighting. He fought for another 20 minutes, with his life bleeding out of him drop by drop, and he killed 7 more Drevok before his body finally gave out, and he collapsed against the wall of the command center. Lieutenant Morgan was at his side in seconds, and Velrath watched as Brennan grabbed her hand and spoke his final words. "Finish it, Katie," he said. "Show them what we are." Then Captain Jack Brennan died, and Lieutenant Morgan stood up, with tears streaming down her face and fire burning in her eyes, and when she spoke into her radio, her voice was ice. "All units, this is Captain Morgan. We are ending this now. Fix bayonets. And prepare to advance." Velrath did not know what bayonets were, but he watched as the humans attached long blades to the ends of their weapons, and he realized with a shock that they were not going to defend anymore. They were going to attack. The humans poured out of the outpost in a wave of fury and steel, and they crashed into the Drevok lines with a violence that made everything before seem gentle by comparison. And they did not stop when they were wounded, and they did not stop when they were outnumbered, and they simply did not stop. Velrath found himself running with them, his own weapon in his hands, and he did not know why he was doing it, but something in him could not let these impossible creatures fight alone. They fought side by side, Corvani and human, and for a moment Velrath felt like he understood what it meant to be part of a pack, to fight not because you expected to win, but because the beings next to you were worth fighting for. Drevok line broke. It did not bend or retreat or reposition. It simply shattered like glass struck by a hammer. And the warriors who had been so confident in their numbers suddenly found themselves running from creatures half their size who refused to show them mercy. The battle ended 2 hours later when the last Drevok fled into the forest, and Velrath stood among the human soldiers and looked at the destruction around them and tried to understand what he had just witnessed. They had won. Against impossible odds, against an enemy that had never known defeat, against everything that logic and reason said should have happened, they had won. Captain Morgan stood over Brennan's body with the other soldiers gathered around her, and they were singing something soft and sad that Velrath did not understand, but somehow felt in his chest anyway. Sergeant Cole approached him, with blood covering most of his body, and a wound on his head that should have killed him hours ago. "Commander," Cole said, "thank you for fighting with us." Velrath looked at this impossible creature, this soft, fragile being who had just helped to feed an army, and he did not know what to say. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why did Captain Brennan keep fighting when he knew he was dying? Why did any of you keep fighting when surrender would have been so much easier?" Cole thought about this for a moment, and when he answered, his voice was quiet. "Because that is what humans do, Commander. We do not know how to quit. We do not know how to give up. We only know how to keep going until we win or until we die trying." He smiled, and for once, it was not a predator's smile. It was something softer, something almost gentle. 3 days after the battle, the reinforcements finally arrived, and Velrath stood at the landing zone, watching the massive Corvani transports descend through the clouds, and he thought about how different everything looked now compared to how it had looked when the humans first arrived. The outpost was scarred and broken, with entire sections of wall missing, and craters dotting the ground where artillery had fallen. But it was still standing, still functioning, still alive, just like the humans who had saved it. Velrath walked through the human camp in the quiet hours of the morning, and observed the soldiers as they went about the business of recovery and mourning and healing, and what he saw there taught him more about humanity than all the battles combined. They were burying their dead. The humans had dug graves in the soft earth behind the outpost, and they had wrapped their fallen comrades in clean white cloth, and now they were lowering them into the denge, ground one by one, while singing songs that made Velrath's chest ache, even though he could not understand the words. He saw Sergeant Cole standing over one of the graves, with his head bowed and his lips moving in silent words, and he saw the other soldiers placing small objects into the earth beside their friends, tokens and trinkets, and personal items that held meaning only to those who understood. Captain Morgan approached him as he watched, and she looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, like something inside her had been drained away and would take a long time to refill. "Commander Velrath," she said, "thank you for coming." "Captain Morgan," Velrath replied, and he noticed that she did not flinch at the title that had belonged to Brennan just days ago. "I wanted to pay my respects to your fallen." Morgan nodded and stood beside him as the burial ceremony continued, and they watched in silence as one by one the human soldiers said goodbye to the friends they would never see again. "Can I ask you something?" Velrath said finally. "Of course," Morgan replied. "How do your people do this?" he asked, and it was the same question he had asked before, but this time it meant something different. "How do you go through such terrible experiences and still find the strength to keep going, to keep caring, to keep being human?" Morgan was quiet for a long time, and Velrath watched her face as she searched for the right words. "Commander, do you know the history of my planet?" Velrath nodded, because he had read the files and learned about the wars and the disasters and the countless ways that humans had tried to destroy themselves. "Then you know that we have been through worse than this," Morgan said. "We have survived ice ages and plagues and famines and wars that killed millions of our own kind. And every time we thought we could not possibly endure any more suffering, we found a way to get back up and keep moving forward." She looked at the graves where her soldiers were being laid to rest. "Every human alive today is descended from people who should have died, but did not," she continued. "We carry the strength of 100 billion ancestors in our blood, and when we face impossible situations, we hear their voices telling us that they did not survive and struggle and sacrifice just so we could give up when things got hard." Velrath thought about this, about the weight of history that these creatures carried inside them, and he began to understand something that had confused him since the beginning. "That is why you do not fear death," he said. Morgan shook her head. "No, Commander, we fear death very much, but we fear other things more. We fear failing the people who depend on us. We fear letting down the memory of those who came before us. We fear being the generation that finally broke after 100,000 years of surviving." Smiled, and there was sadness in it, but also pride. "Humans are not brave because we do not feel fear. We are brave because we feel fear, and we fight anyway." The burial ceremony ended, and the soldiers began to disperse back to their duties, but many of them stopped to shake Velrath's hand or pat him on the shoulder as they passed, and he realized that they had accepted him as one of their own, as a member of their pack. That night, Velrath sat in his quarters and wrote his report to the Galactic Council, and he chose his words very carefully, because he knew that what he said would shape how the galaxy viewed humanity for generations to come. "I have fought beside humanity," he wrote, "and I have seen things that I still do not fully understand. I have seen soldiers continue fighting with wounds that should have killed them. I have seen commanders sacrifice themselves to save their troops. I have seen warriors laugh in the face of certain death and refuse to accept that they were beaten." He paused and thought about Brennan and Morgan and Cole and all the other humans who had shown him what courage really meant. "They are small and fragile and short-lived," he continued. "They have no natural weapons and no armor and no special abilities that would make them dangerous in combat. And yet, they are the most terrifying species I have ever encountered. Not because they enjoy war, although some of them clearly do, and not because they are cruel, although they are capable of great cruelty when they need to be, but because they simply do not know how to stop. The Drevok believed they understood fear, but they had never faced an enemy that hunted them back. They had never faced an enemy that got stronger when wounded, and more determined when outnumbered, and more dangerous when cornered. The Drevok did not understand that they were not the predators in this war. They were the prey, and by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. Velrath put down his writing tool and looked out the window at the stars. If the Drevok wish to face extinction, let them continue this conflict, he wrote. If they wish to survive, they should make peace immediately, because the humans do not know how to stop, and they do not know how to lose, and they do not know how to quit. Fortunately for the galaxy, they have chosen to be our friends, and I pray that we never give them reason to change their minds. The next morning, Velrath went to the landing zone to watch the human transport prepare to depart for their next assignment. And he found Captain Morgan waiting for him, with Sergeant Cole and the other surviving soldiers standing behind her. "Commander," Morgan said, "it has been an honor." Velrath took her hand in the human gesture of farewell that he had learned during their time together. "The honor was mine, Captain," he said, "and I hope that when this war is over, our species can be more than allies. I hope we can be friends." Morgan smiled, and this time there was no sadness in it, only warmth. "I would like that very much." The humans boarded their transport, and the engines roared to life, and as the ship rose into the sky, Velrath saw Sergeant Cole standing at the ramp waving at him. Velrath waved back. He stood there for a long time after the ship had disappeared into the clouds, thinking about everything he had witnessed and everything he had learned. And finally he turned and walked back to the outpost where his own soldiers were waiting. He thought about the old Corvani saying that his grandmother used to tell him, "Judge a species not by their claws, but by their hearts." And as he walked, he added a new verse of his own. "And fear the ones whose hearts are kind, yet hands remember war."